When the children of Havenwood started disappearing, they needed a villain. So, they pointed at me. For 20 years, I lived under the shadow of their lies, their hatred. But the real monster? He was hiding in plain sight, behind a face everyone trusted. What terrible truth did they ignore for so long? Before the whispers began, before my name became a curse on their lips, Havenwood, Vermont, was my sanctuary. Tucked amidst rolling green hills and maple forests that blazed with color each autumn, it was the kind of town where everyone knew your name, and the scent of freshly baked pie often drifted from open windows. My little corner of this idyll was the Story Nook, a children's bookstore just off the town square. It wasn't just a business to me, it was a passion, a haven within a haven, filled with colorful book spines, cozy reading corners, and the hushed anticipation of young minds eager for adventure. I poured my heart into that store. The walls were lined with shelves I'd built myself, painted in cheerful yellows and blues. My greatest joy was story hour. The children would gather on a brightly colored rug, their faces upturned and shining, as I brought tales of dragons, distant lands, and brave little heroes to life. I didn't have children of my own, but these moments, these shared journeys into imagination, filled a space in my soul. I dreamed of expanding the Story Nook, of creating a real community literacy center where children and adults alike could discover the magic of words. Life was quiet, predictable in the best way, and I felt a deep sense of belonging, a gentle rhythm to my days. Then came the summer that changed everything, the summer the idyllic portrait of Havenwood began to crack. Little Emily Carter, just 6 years old with bright pigtails and a missing front tooth, vanished from the town park. One moment she was laughing on the swings, her mother chatting with a friend nearby, the next, she was simply gone. A wave of disbelief and then icy fear washed over Havenwood. Doors were locked earlier, children were kept closer, and a heavy silence replaced the usual cheerful hum of our small town. We were a community unused to such darkness, and it unsettled us to our very core. In those first bewildering days, as search parties combed the woods and Sheriff Jenkins asked his careful, serious questions, a different kind of unease began to creep in, like a fog. The whispers started small, insidious. I had been at the Story Nook that afternoon, which bordered the park. Someone remembered seeing me walk by the park entrance earlier. I was quiet, wasn't I? A bit. Eccentric, perhaps. Childless, yet I ran a children's bookstore, spent so much time around children. It was just talk, the nervous chatter of a frightened town looking for an explanation, any explanation. I told myself it meant nothing, that their fear was making them irrational. I felt their pain, their terror for Emily, but I couldn't yet comprehend that their fear would soon turn on me. My own distress over Emily's disappearance was immense. I knew her well. She was a regular at Story Hour, her favorite book a well-worn copy of a tale about a brave squirrel. I replayed that day in my mind countless times, searching for any detail, any glimpse of something amiss that I might have overlooked. The park, usually a place of joy, now felt like a gaping wound in the heart of our town. I tried to offer comfort where I could, but I started noticing the averted gazes, the way conversations would hush when I approached. It was a subtle shift, a chilling undercurrent that made my skin prickle with a dawning, nameless dread. A few months later, as autumn leaves were beginning to fall, the unthinkable happened again. Timmy Evans, a boisterous 7-year-old boy known for his infectious giggle and love of fire trucks, disappeared from his own front yard, just a few streets away from where Emily was last seen. The town's fear exploded into outright panic, and then, into a focused, desperate anger. This second blow was too much for Havenwood to bear. They needed an answer, a target for their grief and rage, and the whispers about me had already laid the groundwork. This time, the accusations weren't just murmurs. I remember the town meeting vividly. It was held in the old Grange Hall, packed to the rafters with pale, strained faces. Martha Evans, Timmy's mother, stood up, her voice raw with unspeakable pain, her eyes blazing. She pointed a shaking finger directly at me, where I sat near the back, my heart hammering against my ribs. She screamed that I was the one, that I had to be. That I was the strange woman who lurked around children. The words struck me with physical force, stealing my breath. A chorus of agreement, of suspicion finally given voice, rippled through the crowd. It was a terrifying sound, the sound of a community turning. Sheriff Roy Jenkins, a man I'd known for years, a man whose children had attended my story hours, did little to quell the rising tide. He looked overwhelmed, his face drawn. He didn't directly accuse me then, not in so many words, but he announced that his investigation would be looking very closely at anyone who had unusual access or interest in children. Every eye in that hall turned to me. It was a condemnation without a trial, a verdict delivered by fear. In that moment, I felt the ground beneath me crumble. The life I knew was over. The immediate aftermath was brutal, a swift and merciless destruction of everything I had built. The day after the town meeting, I found the windows of the Story Nook shattered, jagged shards of glass glittering on the sidewalk like malevolent stars. Across the cheerful yellow paint of my front door, someone had scrawled a single, hideous word in blood red: monster. It was a chilling sight, a declaration of my new identity in Havenwood. My stomach churned with the mixture of terror and a profound, helpless sorrow. The customers, of course, vanished overnight. Parents who once smiled and thanked me for inspiring their children now hurried past my shop, often pulling their own children closer, their faces masks of fear or outright hostility. The cheerful bell above my door, which used to announce a friendly face or an eager young reader, fell silent. The silence in the Story Nook became a suffocating presence, a constant reminder of what I had lost, of what I had become in their eyes. My dreams of a community literacy center, once so vibrant, now seemed like a cruel, distant fantasy. My meager savings began to dwindle as the weeks turned into months. No one would buy my books, no one would even meet my eye. The bank manager, a man I'd shared polite conversation with for years, suddenly became formal and distant when I inquired about a small loan to tide me over. The unspoken accusation hung in the air between us, thicker than any words. I was forced to close the Story Nook, packing away the books, the colorful rug, the remnants of my shattered dream, with hands that trembled. Each box felt like a coffin for a piece of my soul. The ostracism was complete. Friends I'd known my whole life crossed the street to avoid me. Polite nods turned into icy glares. Invitations stopped. My phone ceased to ring, except for the occasional cruel prank call in the dead of night, voices distorted, hissing threats or vile names. I became a ghost in my own town, a pariah confined to the small, creaking house on the edge of Havenwood that my parents had left me. The local children, fed on the hushed warnings of their parents, began to call it the witch's house, daring each other to run past my gate. The weight of their collective hatred, their absolute conviction of my guilt, was a physical burden. It pressed down on me day and night, stealing my sleep, my appetite, my will to even face the daylight. How could they believe such a thing of me? How could a life of quiet decency be so easily erased by fear and suspicion? The accusation was a living entity, a monstrous lie that had wrapped its tendrils around my existence, squeezing the very life out of me. And this, I would come to learn, was only the beginning of the darkness, a chilling prelude to years of silent suffering. What happened next was a slow descent into a despair so profound, I sometimes wondered if I'd ever find my way back to the light. The truth, I knew, was buried deep, but the journey to unearth it seemed impossibly long, and I was so utterly alone. If you've ever felt the sting of a false word, or the crushing weight of being misunderstood, perhaps you know a fraction of what I began to endure. Stick with my story, and you'll see how one woman, armed with nothing but a desperate hope for truth, can begin to fight back against the darkest of lies. Please consider subscribing and hitting that like button if you're ready to hear more, and let me know in the comments from what corner of the world you're listening. The closure of the Story Nook wasn't an end to my suffering, but rather the start of a new, more insidious phase of my torment. With my little shop gone, the last public vestige of my old life, I retreated almost entirely into the confines of my house. It was a small, two-story clapboard, needing paint even before my troubles began, set back from the road by a yard that was slowly surrendering to weeds. It became my prison, my fortress, and my shame, all wrapped into one. The vibrant colors of my bookstore were replaced by the muted, dusty tones of my solitary existence, a visual echo of how my own light felt dimmed, almost extinguished. Days bled into one another, marked only by the changing light outside my grimy windows. I'd wake to the sound of the early morning paper delivery, the thud on a distant neighbor's porch, a reminder of a world I was no longer part of. The silence in my house was a heavy blanket, broken only by the creak of floorboards or the sigh of the wind in the eaves. Sometimes, the silence was so profound, I could hear the frantic beat of my own heart, a trapped bird fluttering against its cage. I tried to read, seeking solace in the familiar comfort of words, but the stories often felt hollow, their fictional woes paling in comparison to the very real nightmare I was living. Martha Evans, Timmy's mother, became a spectral presence in my life, even though I rarely saw her. Her grief, understandable and immense, had solidified into a righteous fury, and I was its unwavering target. I'd hear her name invoked in hushed tones if I ever dared venture to the corner store for meager supplies, her pain a constant, unspoken accusation that followed me like a shadow. Her suffering was a public spectacle, while mine was a private agony, unseen and unacknowledged. Sheriff Jenkins, for his part, made no further direct moves against me, but the cloud of his ongoing investigation never truly lifted. It was a convenient way to keep me marginalized, a perpetual suspect without the need for actual evidence. My reputation, once that of a kind, bookish woman, was now irrevocably tarnished. I was Clara the child snatcher, the Havenwood witch. These weren't just whispers anymore, they were accepted facts in the town's collective consciousness. I saw it in the eyes of the checkout girl at the grocery store, her forced politeness barely masking her fear. I felt it when old acquaintances would suddenly find something fascinating to look at on the opposite side of the street if they saw me approaching. The isolation was an ache that settled deep in my bones, a coldness that no amount of tea or blankets could dispel. My self-esteem, already fragile from a lifetime of being somewhat on the periphery, shattered. I began to question everything about myself. Had I missed something? Was there some unconscious darkness within me that I hadn't recognized? The town's unwavering belief in my guilt was a powerful corrosive, eating away at my own sense of reality. There were dark nights when I would stare at my reflection, searching for the monster they all saw, half expecting to find it staring back. The loneliness was a cruel companion, whispering doubts and fears into the emptiness of my home. Sleep offered little escape. My dreams were haunted by the faces of Emily and Timmy, their innocent eyes questioning, sometimes accusing. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom sound of children's laughter echoing in the darkness, a cruel mockery of the joy I once found in their presence. The joy I took in stories, in the simple pleasure of a well-turned phrase, now felt tainted, as if I no longer deserved such small comforts. The world I had known, the simple, decent world I believed in, had revealed a terrifyingly ugly underside, and I was trapped in it. The financial strain was immense. With the story nook gone, my income ceased. My savings, never substantial, were quickly depleted by basic necessities. I sold what little jewelry my mother had left me, then some cherished pieces of furniture. Each sale was a small death, another piece of my past slipping away. The fear of destitution was a constant, gnawing anxiety, adding another layer to my already unbearable burden. How long could I survive like this, cut off and alone, with no prospect of work or acceptance? Sometimes, a flicker of anger would pierce through the despair. A raw, burning indignation at the injustice of it all. How dare they? How could they be so blind, so cruel? But the anger was usually short-lived, quickly doused by the overwhelming sense of helplessness. Who would listen to me? Who would believe the monster of Havenwood? I had no allies, no voice loud enough to counter the chorus of condemnation. So, the anger would curdle into a bitter resentment, a poison I swallowed daily. The changing seasons outside my window became a painful reminder of the life passing me by. Springs I didn't celebrate, summers I spent hidden away, autumns where the vibrant colors felt like a personal affront, and long, cold winters that mirrored the iciness in my own heart. I watched from my window as other people lived their lives, their routines uninterrupted, their laughter and conversations a world away from my silent suffering. It was like being a ghost at my own funeral, witnessing a life I was no longer permitted to live. I learned to make myself small, to be invisible. My trips to the store were quick, time for when it was least busy, my head down, avoiding eye contact. The vibrant clothes I once favored were replaced by drab, shapeless garments, as if I were trying to blend into the shadows, to confirm their image of me as someone strange and apart. The shame was a constant companion, a heavy cloak I couldn't shed, even in the privacy of my own home. It clung to me, a testament to their power over my life. Yet, even in the deepest pit of my despair, a tiny, stubborn spark refused to be completely extinguished. It was a refusal to fully become the monster they had created. It was the memory of the children's trusting faces at story hour, the pure, uncomplicated joy of sharing a tale. It was the deeply buried conviction, however faint, that the truth, my truth, still mattered, even if only to me. This tiny ember of defiance was all I had left. This existence, this half-life, stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The town of Havenwood settled into its narrative about me, the initial hysteria calming into a fixed, ugly certainty. I was a fixture of their local horror story, a cautionary tale whispered to misbehaving children. And I, Clara Holloway, simply endured, a prisoner of their making, waiting for something, anything, to change, though hope was a currency I could scarcely afford. The years wore on, each one etching deeper lines of sorrow on my face and a heavier weight on my soul. Little did I know that the silence was eventually going to be broken, not by my own efforts, but by an echo from the past, a faint signal from a world I thought had forgotten me entirely. Years folded into one another, each a near replica of the last, a monotonous landscape of solitude and unspoken condemnation. The sharp edges of my grief had dulled into a chronic ache, a permanent fixture in the architecture of my soul. Havenwood had, for the most part, moved on. The memory of Emily and Timmy became a sad chapter in the town's history, their disappearances attributed to the monster who lived on its fringe, a convenient, if tragic, resolution. I continued my isolated existence, the witch in the house on Hemlock Lane, a figure of local lore more than a living, breathing woman. The house itself seemed to absorb my sorrow, its timbers groaning in the wind like a sigh of shared despair. The garden, once my mother's pride, was a tangle of weeds and overgrown rose bushes, their thorns like a protective barrier around my crumbling sanctuary. I rarely ventured beyond its perimeter, and when I did, it was with a sense of trepidation, my senses hyper-alert to the stares, the hushed comments, the palpable wall of animosity that still radiated from the townsfolk. The passage of time had not softened their stance, it had merely cemented it. Then, one damp autumn afternoon, perhaps a decade or more after Timmy Evans vanished, something happened, a small, almost insignificant event that nonetheless planted a tiny, unsettling seed in the barren soil of my mind. I was at the town library, a rare foray into the public sphere, driven by a desperate need for new reading material. The library was one of the few places I could occasionally visit without overt hostility, perhaps because the inherent quietness of the space offered a kind of anonymity. I kept to the most deserted aisles, my head bowed, my selections made with hurried efficiency. As I was browsing the local history section, more out of habit than any real interest, I came across a stack of old, out-of-county newspapers bundled for archiving. My gaze idly scanned the headlines, yellowed with age. One small article, tucked away at the bottom of a page from a paper published in a neighboring county, caught my eye. It was dated a few years after the Havenwood disappearances. "Community grieves missing child," the headline read. The story was brief, lacking in detail, but it mentioned a young girl vanishing from a public park during a local festival, under circumstances eerily similar to other unsolved cases in the region. A faint chill traced its way down my spine. Eerily similar. The phrase snagged in my thoughts. It was vague, of course. Children went missing, tragically, in many places. But something about the sparse details, a public park, a community event, the suddenness of it, pricked at a long dormant corner of my awareness. I read the short piece again, my fingers tracing the faded print. The location was a town called Oak Haven, about 60 miles away. I'd never heard of it. There was no mention of suspects, no follow-up. It was just a small, sad story, one of many that likely faded from public memory. I tried to dismiss it. It was probably nothing, a coincidence. My mind, starved for any distraction from its own misery, was perhaps grasping at straws, seeing patterns where none existed. Havenwood had its monster, and that monster was me. The town, the sheriff, everyone had decided. Yet, the article lingered. A tiny, persistent splinter of unease. I didn't mention it to anyone. There was no one to tell. Who would believe that Clara Holloway, the supposed child abductor, was suddenly interested in other missing children cases for any reason other than some twisted, morbid curiosity? Life resumed its bleak rhythm. The Oakhaven article remained a faint, nagging question mark at the back of my mind, too insubstantial to offer any real hope, yet too unsettling to completely forget. It was like finding a single, unfamiliar piece from a puzzle you thought you knew, a piece that didn't quite fit the picture everyone else had assembled. But what could I do with it? I was a pariah, powerless, my credibility non-existent. The thought of approaching Sheriff Jenkins, or anyone in authority, with such a flimsy observation was laughable. They would see it as a pathetic attempt to deflect blame, or worse, a sign of my own unraveling mind. So, I kept it to myself, another secret in a life increasingly defined by them. But the seed, once planted, had taken root, however shallowly. It was the first time in all those desolate years that a question, rather than a statement of my guilt, had echoed in the silence of my mind regarding the children. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something far more fragile, a sliver of doubt about the absolute certainty of the narrative that had destroyed my life. A whisper so faint, I could barely hear it above the roar of my own condemnation. The isolation continued, a suffocating blanket. The world outside my windows went on, oblivious to the faint stirrings within me. Children grew up, new families moved to Havenwood, and the story of Clara Holloway, the monster on Hemlock Lane, was passed down, a chilling piece of local folklore. I remained a prisoner of that story, but now, a tiny, almost imperceptible crack had appeared in the wall of my cell. It was just a sliver of light, so faint it might have been an illusion, but it was there. The years had taught me patience, if nothing else. A terrible, soul-crushing patience born of enduring the unendurable. I knew, with a certainty that had settled deep in my bones, that my life would never be what it once was. The story nook was gone forever, my reputation was in ashes. But this tiny, unsettling echo from another town, another tragedy, refused to be entirely silenced. It lay dormant, waiting, a question mark in the long, dark sentence of my life. And as more time passed, that question mark, almost imperceptibly, began to grow. Perhaps you're listening to this from a place where hope feels distant, where a single word of doubt against a mountain of accusation seems like nothing. But sometimes, nothing is exactly where a new story begins to form. If you're finding a connection in my journey, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that like button, and maybe share in the comments what town or city you're tuning in from. It's a comfort to know these words are reaching out, beyond the confines of my own long silence. The path ahead was still shrouded in darkness, but for the first time in a very long time, I sensed the faintest possibility of a flicker. The slow, monotonous rhythm of my isolated existence continued for several more years. The article about the Oakhaven disappearance remained a half-forgotten note in the back of my mind, a faint dissonance in the otherwise overwhelming chorus of my guilt. I was in my late 50s now, the vibrant energy of my youth long since eroded by grief and solitude. The lines on my face told a story of hardship, and my eyes, I suspected, held a permanent shadow. Havenwood, and my place in it as the resident monster, seemed as immutable as the Vermont hills themselves. Then, the past, which I had assumed was buried and settled, began to stir. It arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the tentative knock of a young man at my weathered front door. His name was Ben Carter, he told me, his voice earnest, a slight tremor of nervousness in it. He was a journalist, working on a podcast, a modern kind underscore of storytelling that felt alien to my secluded world. He was revisiting Havenwood's most infamous cold case, the disappearance of Emily Carter and Timmy Evans. And Emily, he explained, was his aunt. He'd been too young to remember her, but the family tragedy had shaped his life, his career. My first instinct was to slam the door. Another ghoul, come to pick at old wounds, to rehash the lurid tale of Clara Holloway for a new audience. My heart hammered against my ribs, a familiar drumbeat of fear and resentment. I'd had my fill of reporters in the early days, their prying questions and sensational headlines. But there was something in Ben Carter's eyes, a seriousness, a genuine sorrow that seemed to go beyond mere journalistic ambition. Reluctantly, against every instinct honed by years of self-preservation, I let him in. He sat awkwardly on the edge of my mother's old armchair, its faded floral pattern a stark contrast to his modern attire. He set up a small recording device, his movements precise, respectful. He started with the usual questions, tracing the timeline of the disappearances, my proximity to the park, the swift condemnation by the town. I answered in clipped, weary tones, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I offered nothing new, nothing to contradict the established narrative. What was the point? He, like everyone else, already knew the story. Or thought he did. He was polite, his questions carefully phrased, but I could feel the underlying assumption: he was talking to the woman who had, in some way, been responsible. He was here to understand the why, perhaps, to delve into the psychology of the monster. I braced myself for the inevitable pain of his polite, yet probing, inquiry. I had built walls around my heart so thick, I doubted even genuine empathy could penetrate them. I just wanted it to be over, for him to leave me to my solitude. Then, as he was discussing the second disappearance, Timmy Evans, he mentioned a detail, almost casually. He said, and of course, there was that peculiar red toy truck found near the riverbank a week later, the one the sheriff initially thought was a significant lead, but then dismissed. A jolt went through me, so sharp it was almost physical. The red toy truck. I remembered it vaguely from the frantic news reports at the time, a small, desperate clue that had led nowhere. But what struck me was his certainty, his casual reference to it as something initially thought significant, then dismissed. That detail about the truck, especially the part about Sheriff Jenkins initially considering it significant and then dismissing it, had never been public knowledge. It was a minor investigative point, one that would only have been known to the police, or perhaps to someone intimately involved with the Evans family who had been privy to their conversations with the sheriff. It wasn't the kind of information that would have circulated in general town gossip or made it into the broader news reports that focused on me. How did Ben Carter, a young man piecing together events from decades past, know this specific nuance of the investigation? A cold wave washed over me. For years, I had accepted the town's narrative, not because I believed myself guilty of the act, but because I believed in their unified perception of my guilt. Their version of events, focused entirely on me, had become the only version. But this small, seemingly insignificant detail about the toy truck, and Jenkins' shifting stance on it, suddenly felt wrong. It was a crack, not just in Ben's understanding, but potentially in the entire foundation of the story that had entombed me. I looked at Ben, truly looked at him, for the first time. His brow was furrowed in concentration as he reviewed his notes. He was young, perhaps a little naive in his earnestness, but he was also thorough. Where had he gotten that piece of information? And why did it feel so jarringly out of place? My mind, rusty from years of disuse in any investigative capacity, began to whir. The old, faded memory of the Oak Haven article, the eerily similar disappearance, flickered at the edge of my consciousness. This was the moment. The catalyst. It wasn't a dramatic revelation, no sudden confession or exonerating piece of evidence handed to me on a silver platter. It was a small inconsistency, a tiny thread sticking out from the tapestry of lies that had been woven around me. But for someone who had lived in darkness for so long, even the smallest thread, if pulled, might unravel everything. The despair that had been my constant companion for 2 decades was suddenly pierced by a different emotion, a sharp, urgent, and utterly terrifying surge of indignation, coupled with a desperate need to understand. I didn't say anything to Ben then about the toy truck, about the sudden, disquieting question that had taken root in my mind. The habit of silence, of suspicion, was too deeply ingrained. But as he packed up his equipment, thanking me for my time, his parting words were, "I just want to find the truth, Ms. Holloway." For Emily. For everyone? His sincerity, which I had initially doubted, now resonated with a new, disturbing clarity. Perhaps his truth, and my truth, were not as far apart as I had always been led to believe. When the door closed behind him, I stood in the silence of my dusty living room, the echo of his words, and that one peculiar detail about a red toy truck, reverberating in the stillness. The weight of years of injustice, of internalized shame, still pressed down on me. But now, mixed with it, was something new, the faintest, most fragile stirring of a fighting spirit I thought had died long ago. The path ahead was invisible, shrouded in fog, but for the first time, I felt an undeniable compulsion to take a step. The breaking point had arrived, not as a collapse, but as a quiet internal shift, a decision that the story of Clara Holloway, the monster of Havenwood, might not yet be fully written. After Ben Carter left, the house felt different. The silence was still there, but it was no longer entirely empty. It thrummed with the echo of that one unsettling detail about Timmy Evans' red toy truck, and Sheriff Jenkins' quiet dismissal of it as a lead. It was a tiny inconsistency, a loose thread in a tightly woven narrative, but it was enough to disrupt the suffocating stasis of my existence. The encounter had unsettled me, not in the old, familiar way of dredging up painful memories, but by planting a seed of active, urgent curiosity. My initial wariness of Ben slowly began to morph into a cautious reevaluation. He was seeking truth, he'd said. While I still harbored a deep-seated distrust of anyone probing into my past, his unintentional revelation had armed me with a question, a starting point. For the first time in 2 decades, I felt a flicker of agency, however small. The helplessness that had been my constant companion began, almost imperceptibly, to recede, replaced by a nascent, tentative resolve. I couldn't confront the town, not yet. But perhaps I could confront the past, my own memories, the few tangible remnants of that terrible time. I unearthed a battered cardboard box from the back of a closet, a box I hadn't opened in years. It contained what little I had salvaged from the story nook, mostly old invoices and supplier catalogs, but also a few local newspapers from that horrifying summer and autumn. Their headlines screamed of the town's fear, of the mounting suspicion against me. Reading them again was like pressing on a fresh bruise, but this time, I wasn't just reliving the pain, I was searching. I scanned the articles, looking for any mention of that red toy truck, any detail about where it was found or who found it. There was little beyond the initial brief reports of its discovery near the riverbank, a detail that had quickly been overshadowed by the escalating focus on me. Sheriff Jenkins had made a vague statement at the time about all leads being pursued, but there was no public record of why that particular lead was dropped. The official narrative, the one fed to the desperate town, had swiftly and decisively pointed away from stray objects and towards the strange woman who ran the children's bookstore. It was a chillingly effective diversion. My mind kept returning to Mr. Abernathy. Arthur Abernathy, the town historian, a man older than me by a good 20 years even back then. He had been a fixture in Havenwood for as long as I could remember, a kindly, avuncular figure with a gentle smile and a wealth of local knowledge. He volunteered at countless community events, always ready with a comforting word or a historical anecdote. He had even expressed his condolences to me, in his quiet, dignified way, after the story nook was vandalized, shaking his head sadly at the town's misguided fear. He seemed to be everywhere, a benign, almost grandfatherly presence. During the search for Emily, and then for Timmy, Mr. Abernathy had been a pillar of quiet support for the grieving families, often seen offering tea or a steadying arm. He was present at the periphery of every search party, every prayer vigil, his expression one of profound, shared sorrow. He knew the woods around Havenwood like the back of his hand, often offering suggestions to the search teams, areas they might have missed. His helpfulness had been lauded at the time. Now, a cold tendril of unease began to curl in my stomach. Was his presence helpful, or was it something else? Opportunistic? Controlling? I pulled out an old Havenwood community picnic photo, one I'd kept because it showed the Story Nook stall in happier days. There, in the background, almost blending into the crowd but visible if you look closely, was Mr. Abernathy, chatting amiably with a group of parents, a benign smile on his face. He was always there. Always in the background, always observing, always present. The Oak Haven article, The one about the child vanishing from a park during a festival in another county floated back into my mind. Could there be a connection? It seemed preposterous. Mr. Abernathy was a town elder, respected, almost revered. The thought of him being involved in something so monstrous was so far outside the realm of what Havenwood and I had ever considered. It felt like a betrayal of reality itself. I even entertained, for a brief, desperate moment, the idea that Sheriff Jenkins might have deliberately covered something up, perhaps due to incompetence or to protect someone influential. But Jenkins, for all his flaws and his willingness to let me become the scapegoat, struck me more as a man overwhelmed and out of his depth than someone capable of orchestrating a complex, malicious deception. He had followed the path of least resistance, the path that led directly to my door, because it was the easiest, loudest path presented to him. No, the disquiet I felt was coalescing around Mr. Abernathy, around his constant, unassuming presence. It was a horrifying thought, one I tried to push away. Accusing him, even in the privacy of my own mind, felt like a fresh madness. But the red toy truck, dismissed as insignificant. Who would have the influence, the subtle power, to make Sheriff Jenkins dismiss a potentially crucial piece of evidence? Someone trusted. Someone whose opinion carried weight. Someone like Arthur Abernathy, the knowledgeable town historian, perhaps suggesting it was just a lost toy, unrelated, a red herring. I realized I needed more than just my own fractured memories and old newspaper clippings. Ben Carter, with his podcast and his access to archives I couldn't dream of reaching, might be the key. He was looking for the truth, he'd said. What if the truth was far stranger, far more terrible than even he imagined? The thought of approaching him again, of sharing these nascent, monstrous suspicions, filled me with a mixture of terror and a desperate, burgeoning hope. He would likely think I was truly unhinged, trying to deflect blame onto a beloved town figure. But the alternative, to do nothing, to let this horrifying possibility lie dormant, was no longer an option. The small spark of indignation Ben's visit had ignited was growing, fanned by these new, terrible thoughts. The investigation, if it could even be called that at this stage, was no longer just about clearing my name. If there was even a sliver of a chance that the real monster was someone else, someone still walking free, then I had a duty, a terrifying, unwanted duty, to find out. My quiet life of suffering was over. A new, far more perilous chapter was beginning, one that would force me to confront not only the town's past, but also its most respected figures. The quiet investigation had begun, and I was its most unlikely, and most frightened, detective. The decision to approach Ben Carter again was one of the hardest I'd ever made. It meant exposing my most fragile, monstrous suspicions, risking his scorn, or worse, his pity. But the image of Mr. Abernathy, his kindly smile now tinged with something sinister in my mind's eye, propelled me forward. I found the contact number he'd left me, my hand trembling as I dialed. When he answered, his voice professional and slightly surprised, I simply said, "Mr. Carter, it's Clara Holloway. I think there are some things we need to talk about, things I didn't mention before." We met at my house again. This time, I was the one leading the conversation, my voice low and hesitant at first, then gaining strength as I laid out my fragmented thoughts. I told him about the red toy truck, and my sudden, chilling realization that its dismissal was never publicly explained. I spoke of Mr. Abernathy's constant, unobtrusive presence at every event, during every search. And then, my breath catching in my throat, I told him about the old newspaper article from Oakhaven, the eerily similar disappearance in another county, a detail I had hoarded like a guilty secret for years. To his credit, Ben listened intently, his initial journalistic eagerness tempered by a growing seriousness. He didn't interrupt, didn't dismiss my concerns as the ramblings of a bitter, ostracized woman. He made notes, his brow furrowed. When I finished, the silence in the room was heavy, charged with the weight of my unbelievable hypothesis. I braced myself for his disbelief, for the polite but firm suggestion that I was letting my imagination, or my desire for another culprit, run away with me. Instead, he looked up from his notes, his gaze direct and thoughtful. He said, "Ms. Holloway, what you're suggesting is extraordinary. Mr. Abernathy is a town institution. Then he paused, and a flicker of something, professional curiosity, perhaps, or the ingrained skepticism of a good journalist, crossed his face. But the Oakhaven case. I've heard whispers of other older disappearances in the wider region, never linked, always just sad, isolated tragedies. And you're right, the toy truck detail is specific. That was all the encouragement I needed. Together, we began to dig. Ben, with his access to online archives, digitized newspaper records, and journalistic databases, started searching for any connections between Arthur Abernathy and Oakhaven, or any other unexplained child disappearances in Vermont and neighboring counties over the past few decades. I, meanwhile, pored over my own limited resources, old Havenwood Town event programs, yearbooks from the local school where Abernathy sometimes gave historical talks, and any photographs I could find from community gatherings from the time of the disappearances. Days turned into weeks. It was painstaking, often disheartening work. For every potential lead, there were a dozen dead ends. We were chasing ghosts, shadows of suspicion based on the thinnest of premises. There were times when I almost faltered, when the sheer improbability of my theory, the beloved image of Mr. Abernathy, threatened to overwhelm my resolve. Was I truly seeing a pattern, or just projecting my own desperate need for an alternative truth onto an innocent man? Then, Ben found something. It was a small mention in an Oakhaven Historical Society newsletter from the year of that town's disappearance. Arthur Abernathy, noted historian from Havenwood, Vermont, had been a guest speaker at their annual Founders' Day festival, the very same festival during which the little girl had vanished from the park. His talk had been on shared traditions of New England small towns. He had family in Oakhaven, the newsletter mentioned, a distant cousin he visited occasionally. A cold dread seeped into me. It wasn't proof, not by any means. But it was a tangible link, a concrete piece of information placing Abernathy in Oakhaven at the precise time of that eerily similar disappearance. Suddenly, his presence wasn't just coincidental, it was specific. We cross-referenced the dates. The Oakhaven Founders' Day Festival had occurred just a few months after Timmy Evans vanished in Havenwood, during a period when Havenwood was still reeling, and Abernathy had been a prominent figure of communal grief and support. Galvanized, we intensified our search. Ben, using his research skills, managed to unearth digitized photos from that Oakhaven Founders' Day festival. And there he was. In the background of a blurry photo of children playing near a refreshment stand, partially obscured but undeniably him, Arthur Abernathy, watching, with that same benign, almost grandfatherly smile I had seen in countless Havenwood photos. Chills ran down my spine. He hadn't just been a guest speaker, he had been present in the park, near the children, just as he had been in Havenwood. The unmasking wasn't a single dramatic moment of revelation. It was a slow, horrifying accretion of details, a chilling mosaic pieced together from disparate, seemingly innocuous fragments. We found other instances, other small towns in the region that had experienced unexplained child disappearances over the years, always isolated incidents, never linked. And in a disturbing number of them, Ben, through meticulous research of local archives and old news reports, found traces of Arthur Abernathy's presence, a historical society lecture, a visit to relatives, participation in a regional crafts fair. Always discreet, always in the background, always the respected historian. The why began to emerge, not as a clear motive like greed or revenge, but as something far more chilling, a pattern of predatory behavior hidden behind a meticulously crafted facade of harmlessness and civic virtue. Abernathy wasn't just a historian, he was a collector of trust, a manipulator of community sentiment. His knowledge of local events, his involvement in town activities, gave him unparalleled access and an almost invisible presence. He could move freely, observe unnoticed, and, most terrifyingly, subtly influence perceptions. Who would suspect the kind, elderly Mr. Abernathy, the man who knew everyone's great-grandparents? The red toy truck suddenly made a sickening kind of sense. Abernathy, with his esteemed reputation and his role as a comforter to the grieving, could easily have approached Sheriff Jenkins with a quiet word of advice. Perhaps he'd suggested the truck was likely a random loss, a distraction from the real issue, subtly guiding the investigation away from any physical evidence that might, however tangentially, point away from the convenient scapegoat the town was already primed to accept, me. He had played on Havenwood's fear and its desire for a quick resolution, ensuring his own monstrous actions remained hidden. The realization was like a physical blow. The man who had shaken his head in sympathy at my misfortune, the man who had been a constant, reassuring presence in the town's darkest hours, was the architect of that darkness. He hadn't just let me take the blame, he had likely orchestrated it, using my eccentricity and isolation as the perfect cover. My 20 years of suffering, the destruction of my life, had been his shield. The relief of finally understanding was inextricably mixed with a profound, nauseating horror and a cold, righteous fury that burned away the last vestiges of my fear. The true villain had a name, a face, and a history of hidden atrocities. Now, the question was, what were we going to do about it? This discovery was a terrible vindication. My name might one day be cleared, but the cost was the unmasking of a monster who had preyed on innocence for decades, protected by the very community he was destroying from within. The weight of this knowledge was immense, but it also brought a chilling clarity. The time for quiet suffering was over. The time for justice had begun. It's a strange and terrifying thing to realize the person you and your entire community trusted is the source of your deepest pain. Has a truth ever been revealed to you that shattered your perception of someone or something you held certain? If these unfolding revelations resonate, and you want to see how this fight for truth continues, please consider subscribing. Your presence here, listening, means more than you know. We were standing on the precipice of a revelation that would rock Havenwood to its core, and I, Clara Holloway, was about to step into the storm. The unmasking of Arthur Abernathy as the probable predator threw Ben and me into a state of agitated paralysis for a short time. The sheer scale of his deception, the decades of calculated evil hidden behind that benign facade, was almost too much to comprehend. We had the pattern, the chilling coincidences, the deeply unsettling presence of Abernathy at multiple scenes of tragedy. But what we had was circumstantial, however compelling it felt to us. Accusing a man like Abernathy, a beloved town elder, based on old newspaper clippings and background appearances in photographs, would be disastrous. We'd be dismissed as conspiracy theorists, or worse, I'd be seen as desperately trying to shift blame, further cementing my image as unhinged. We sat in my dusty living room, the piles of research spread across the floor, the air thick with unspoken horror and a heavy sense of responsibility. Ben, ever the methodical journalist, was the first to speak. He said, "Clara, we can't go to Sheriff Jenkins with this, not yet. Not without something concrete. Something irrefutable. Abernathy is too well entrenched, too respected. They'll laugh us out of the station, or worse, tip him off." He was right. Jenkins, even if he were inclined to believe us, would be up against decades of Abernathy's carefully cultivated reputation. We needed undeniable proof, something that directly linked Abernathy to the children, something that no amount of avuncular charm could explain away. Our blueprint for justice, therefore, couldn't be a direct confrontation or an immediate appeal to the authorities. It had to be a quiet, covert continuation of our investigation, focused now on finding that one piece of damning evidence. The plan began to form, piece by agonizing piece. We knew Abernathy lived alone in his family's ancestral home on the wealthier side of Havenwood, a large, rambling Victorian that always looked perfectly maintained. But Ben had also discovered, through property records, that Abernathy owned another, much smaller property, an old, dilapidated farmhouse on a rarely used road several miles out of town, a relic from a distant branch of his family that he'd inherited years ago. The farmhouse was barely known. It wasn't on any tourist maps, and locals rarely had reason to go down that isolated stretch of road. Abernathy never spoke of it. Why would a man like him, with his comfortable in-town residence, keep such a remote, run-down property? The question hung in the air between us, pregnant with sinister possibility. Could this be where he took them? Could this be where he kept his secrets? It was a horrifying thought, but it was also the most logical place to look for the kind of evidence we needed. The plan was dangerous, bordering on reckless. We would have to observe the farmhouse, to see if Abernathy ever visited it, to understand his routines. If he did go there, we would then have to find a way inside. The legalities of such an action were terrifying, but the moral imperative, the thought of those missing children and the possibility of preventing future tragedies, outweighed our fear of prosecution. We were operating outside the law, but we felt driven by a higher sense of justice. My role, I decided, would be primarily observational at first. I knew Abernathy's routines within Havenwood better than Ben did. I could, with extreme caution, try to ascertain if his in-town schedule had any unexplained gaps that might correspond with trips to this remote farmhouse. Ben, with his younger legs and journalistic penchant for discreet surveillance, would handle the initial reconnaissance of the farmhouse itself, photographing it from a distance, noting any signs of activity, any security measures. There was a moral debate, a quiet one, mostly within myself. Was I becoming what they had accused me of being, someone who skulked in shadows, who broke rules? The irony was not lost on me. But my actions were driven by a desperate need to expose a truth they had buried, a truth that had cost me everything. This wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense, not about inflicting pain for pain's sake. This was about exposing a monster, about reclaiming my stolen life by revealing his. It was about justice for Emily, for Timmy, for the child in Oakhaven, and for any others whose names we didn't yet know. The reckoning would be the truth itself, laid bare for all to see. Ben, despite the risks to his fledgling career, was resolute. The story had consumed him, not just as a journalist, but as Emily Carter's nephew. He felt a personal responsibility to see it through. We agreed on a set of signals, on backup plans if one of us ran into trouble. We were two unlikely allies, a disgraced recluse and a young, ambitious reporter, bound together by a horrifying secret and a shared determination to bring it into the light. The tension in my small house was palpable in the days that followed. Every creak of the floorboards, every unexpected knock at the door, sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I watched Abernathy from afar when he was in town, my heart pounding, trying to appear casual, invisible. He still moved with that same unhurried, kindly air, greeting people, patting children on the head. Knowing what I now suspected, watching him was like observing a venomous snake disguised as a harmless pet. Each smile, each polite nod, felt like a calculated deception, a testament to his chilling mastery of deceit. The blueprint was set. The target was identified. The stakes were impossibly high. We were about to step into the lion's den, armed with nothing but our conviction and a desperate hope that the truth lay hidden in that forgotten farmhouse. The fear was a constant companion, but so was a cold, clear determination. After 20 years of being a victim, I was finally fighting back, not with accusations, but with the relentless pursuit of the evidence that would condemn the real monster of Havenwood. The quiet prelude to the storm was over, the first gusts were beginning to blow. The initial surveillance of Abernathy's old farmhouse fell to Ben. He'd park his nondescript car on a wooded side road, hidden from view, and watch the property through binoculars for hours at a time. The farmhouse itself was dilapidated, paint peeling, windows boarded up on the lower level, set far back from the seldom-traveled dirt road. It looked utterly abandoned, a forgotten relic slowly surrendering to nature. For days, there was no sign of activity, nothing to suggest Abernathy ever came near the place. Doubt began to creep in. Had we been wrong? Was this just another dead end? Another crumbling building full of nothing but dust and decay? Then, late one afternoon, Ben called me, his voice hushed but electric. "Clara, he's here, Abernathy." He just drove up in his old station wagon. Went inside. My heart leaped into my throat. So, he did visit. He did have a reason to come to this desolate place. Ben stayed hidden, observing. Abernathy was inside for less than an hour, then re-emerged, locked the heavy front door, and drove away. He hadn't appeared to be carrying anything in or out. What was he doing in there? We watched him for another week. His visits weren't regular, but they were consistent, perhaps once every few days, always in the late afternoon, always brief. This pattern only deepened our suspicion. These weren't maintenance visits, they were something else, something secretive. The farmhouse, once just a theory, now loomed large in our minds as the most probable keeper of Abernathy's secrets. The time for passive observation was over. We had to get inside. The night we chose was moonless, a heavy cloud cover promising extra darkness. Ben had scouted a rear window that looked less securely boarded than the others. We parked Ben's car a mile away and walked the rest, our footsteps muffled by the damp earth, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the frantic thumping of our own hearts. I had a flashlight, Ben a small pry bar and a camera. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the light. 20 years of being the accused, and now I was about to commit a genuine crime. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. Reaching the back of the farmhouse, cloaked in shadow, felt like stepping into another world. The air was damp, smelling of mildew and decaying leaves. Ben worked quickly and quietly on the boarded-up window. The old wood splintered with a series of sickening cracks that sounded deafening in the stillness. Every nerve in my body screamed. I was convinced that at any moment, headlights would sweep across the yard, or a neighbor, alerted by the noise, would call the sheriff. But nothing happened. The woods remained silent, watchful. Finally, with a groan, a section of board came loose. Ben pried away another, creating a narrow opening. He squeezed through first, then reached back to help me. I scrambled in, clumsy and terrified, landing awkwardly on a dirt-caked floor. We were in what looked like an old kitchen, shrouded in darkness. I fumbled with the flashlight, my hand shaking, and cast its weak beam around. Cobwebs hung like macabre decorations. Dust lay thick on every surface. The silence inside was even more oppressive than outside, heavy and ancient. Suddenly, Ben froze, grabbing my arm. "Headlights," he hissed, his voice barely a whisper. My blood ran cold. We scrambled back from the window, crouching in the deepest shadows, my breath catching in my throat. The distinct rumble of Abernathy's old station wagon approached, much earlier than we'd anticipated. He was making an unscheduled visit. We were trapped. The beam of his headlights swept across the yard, momentarily illuminating the interior of the kitchen through the gaps in the other boarded windows before the car stopped near the front of the house. We heard his car door slam, then the jingle of keys, and the unmistakable sound of the heavy front door creaking open. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed on the wooden floors of the main house. He was inside. With us. My mind raced. If he found us, if he even suspected someone had been there. We were intruders, our story about his guilt would sound like a desperate, preposterous lie. This was it. This was where our desperate gamble could end in disaster. Abernathy moved through the downstairs rooms, his footsteps methodical. Was he looking for something? Or just checking on the place? Each creak of a floorboard under his weight sent a fresh wave of terror through me. Ben and I remained frozen, barely breathing, hidden behind a stack of old, rotted crates in the darkest corner of the kitchen. The flashlight was off, plunging us into near-total blackness. Minutes stretched into an eternity. I could feel the frantic pulse in my own neck, sure he must hear it. Then, his footsteps seemed to be moving towards a different part of the house, away from the kitchen. He was humming, a faint, tuneless sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was a sound of contentment, of someone at ease in his own private domain. After what felt like an age, we heard him moving back towards the front, the jingle of keys again, and then the solid thud of the front door closing and locking. The sound of his car starting, the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway as he pulled away, was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. We waited, heart still pounding, for a long 10 minutes after he left, terrified he might return. When we were finally sure he was gone, the relief was so overwhelming my legs almost buckled. We had been incredibly lucky. But the encounter had stripped away any lingering doubt about the farmhouse. His unexpected visit, his proprietary air, confirmed this place was important to him. With renewed, albeit terrified, urgency, we began our search. The main rooms of the farmhouse were mostly empty, just derelict furniture and layers of dust. But Ben, tapping along the walls in what might have been a pantry or a small storage room off the kitchen, noticed a section that sounded hollow. Behind a rickety set of shelves, we found it, a crudely made door, almost invisible in the dim light, secured with a heavy padlock. This had to be it. This was what Abernathy came to visit. The padlock was old, but sturdy. Ben's pry bar was no match for it. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm us. To have come so far, to be so close. Then I remembered something Abernathy always wore, a small, antique key on a thin chain around his neck, always tucked beneath his shirt. He'd once mentioned it was a memento, a key to his grandfather's old writing desk. What if it was more than that? What if that key opened this lock? It was a wild guess, but we had nothing else. We would have to retreat, for now, and rethink. But as we squeezed back out through the narrow window, leaving the farmhouse to its secrets for one more night, we both knew. We were on the verge of uncovering something truly monstrous. The tension was unbearable, the taste of discovery mixed with the bitter tang of fear. The tightrope we were walking was fraying fast. The discovery of the locked cellar door, coupled with Abernathy's unexpected visit, had galvanized us. The key he wore around his neck became our new obsession. It was a huge risk, but we saw no other way. We couldn't go to the police with just a locked door and a hunch. We needed what was behind it. Ben, using a pretext of needing some obscure historical detail for his podcast, managed to arrange a brief meeting with Abernathy at the town's Historical Society office, a small, cluttered room Abernathy used a few times a week. The plan was audacious. I would create a diversion outside, while Ben, during a moment of contrived clumsiness, would attempt to lift the key. It felt like a scene from a bad spy movie, and my stomach churned with anxiety. I positioned myself across the street from the Historical Society, pretending to be engrossed in a shop window. As Abernathy arrived, I accidentally dropped a bag of groceries I was carrying, scattering apples across the sidewalk, right in his path. As the kind, helpful gentleman he always portrayed, he stooped to help me, his attention momentarily diverted. That was Ben's cue. Inside, Ben tripped near Abernathy's desk where he'd momentarily hung his jacket with the chain visible, and in the ensuing confusion of apologizing and picking up scattered papers, his nimble fingers, guided by adrenaline and desperation, managed to unclip the chain and pocket the key. It was over in seconds. My heart was in my throat as I gathered my apples, thanking Abernathy profusely, his face a mask of benign concern. He had no idea. Later that day, Ben met me, his face pale but triumphant, the small, antique key lying heavily in his palm. It looked ancient, ornate. This had to be it. That night, we returned to the farmhouse, the stolen key clutched in my hand. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now overlaid with a grim determination. We were so close. The key slid into the old padlock with a well-oiled click. It turned. The heavy cellar door creaked open, revealing a narrow, steep flight of wooden stairs descending into utter blackness. A damp, earthy smell, mingled with something else, something vaguely sweet and deeply unsettling, wafted up to meet us. My hand, holding the flashlight, trembled so violently Ben had to steady it. Together, we descended into the unknown. The cellar was small, stone-walled, and terrifyingly silent. And then my flashlight beam fell upon them, shelves. Not shelves of preserves or old tools, but shelves lined with mementos. A small, faded red ribbon, identical to the one Emily Carter had always worn in her pigtails. A battered, die-cast toy fire truck, unmistakably Timmy Evans' most prized possession. A delicate silver locket, tarnished with age, that I didn't recognize, but which spoke of another, unknown victim. There were other items, a child's drawing, a single tiny shoe, a small, hand-knitted mitten. Each one a silent testament to a stolen life, a parent's heartbreak. A wave of nausea and overwhelming grief washed over me. I had to clap a hand over my mouth to stifle a sob. This was it. The irrefutable, horrifying proof. Abernathy wasn't just a predator, he was a collector of sorrow, a keeper of his victims' last innocent possessions. Ben, his face ashen, began to take photographs, his camera's flash momentarily illuminating the ghastly display with stark, clinical precision. We knew we couldn't touch anything, couldn't disturb this grotesque shrine. The evidence had to be pristine for the authorities. Our escape from the cellar, and from the farmhouse, was a blur of adrenaline and horror. We had what we needed. The next morning, Ben didn't go to Sheriff Jenkins. He couldn't be sure how Jenkins would react, whether he'd bungle it, or even worse, tried to protect Abernathy's reputation, and by extension, the town's. Instead, Ben contacted a journalist he knew at a major state newspaper, someone with a reputation for tenacity and a direct line to the state police. He laid out the story, emphasizing the photographic evidence and the urgency. Things moved incredibly fast after that. The state police, alerted by the journalist and presented with Ben's chilling photographs, obtained a warrant. They didn't inform Sheriff Jenkins until they were en route to Havenwood. The raid on Abernathy's farmhouse, and simultaneously on his in-town residence, was swift and professional. The grand reveal, the final confrontation, was not something we orchestrated, but it unfolded with a terrible public drama. The state police chose to arrest Arthur Abernathy at the monthly Havenwood Town Council meeting. It was a bitterly ironic setting. Abernathy was scheduled to receive a small commendation that evening for his decades of dedicated service to preserving Havenwood's history. He was standing at the podium, a benign smile on his face, accepting the plaque from the mayor, when two plainclothes state police officers walked quietly but purposefully down the aisle. I was there, sitting in the back row, a spectator to the unmasking I had helped bring about. Ben was beside me, his tape recorder running. When the officers reached the podium and one of them said, quietly but clearly, "Arthur Abernathy, you are under arrest for suspicion of kidnapping and murder," a collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Abernathy's smile froze, then crumbled. His face went a ghastly shade of pale. He looked confused, then terrified, then, for a fleeting second, something cold and reptilian flickered in his eyes before the mask of bewildered innocence slammed back into place. He began to protest, his voice quavering. "There must be some mistake. This is outrageous. I am Arthur Abernathy." But the officers were impassive, efficient. They cuffed him, the metallic click echoing in the stunned silence of the council chamber. The plaque for his service clattered to the floor. News cameras, alerted by Ben's contact, flashed, capturing his look of utter disbelief and a dawning, animalistic fear. The entire town council, the mayor, the assembled citizens, all stared in stunned, horrified silence. The man they had revered, the man who was the living embodiment of Havenwood's gentle history, was being led away in handcuffs, accused of the most heinous crimes imaginable. I watched him go, my own emotions a maelstrom of relief, profound sorrow, and a chilling, hard-won vindication. 20 years. 20 years I had carried their blame, their hatred. And now, the truth, in all its ugliness, was finally stepping into the light. The whispers in the room began to swell, no longer about me, but about him, about the unbelievable, horrifying revelation that had just shattered their world. The monster of Havenwood had finally been unmasked, and it wasn't me. The grand reveal was complete, and the fallout was just beginning. The arrest of Arthur Abernathy sent shockwaves through Havenwood that resonated far beyond its quiet borders. The town was plunged into a state of collective disbelief, then dawning horror, as the initial details of the evidence found in his farmhouse began to leak out through the state news. The mementos, the hidden cellar, it was the stuff of nightmares, made all the more terrible because the perpetrator was one of their own, a man they had trusted implicitly, admired, and even loved. The pedestal upon which they had placed Arthur Abernathy crumbled into dust, revealing the abyss that lay beneath. Confronted with the undeniable evidence, and perhaps realizing the depth of his depravity was about to be fully exposed, Abernathy confessed. He confessed to the abduction and murder of Emily Carter and Timmy Evans. He confessed to the Oak Haven child. And then, chillingly, he confessed to others, more children from other towns, other times, their names long relegated to cold case files, their families left without answers for decades. The scope of his evil was staggering, a hidden reign of terror that had spanned nearly 40 years. The reaction in Havenwood was a maelstrom of grief, guilt, and profound shame. How could they have been so blind? How could the man who taught their children local history, who judged pie contests, who laid wreaths on Memorial Day, be capable of such monstrous acts? The question hung heavy in the air, unspoken but palpable in every hushed conversation, every anguished look. Their certainty about my guilt now seemed like a collective madness, a willful ignorance they had embraced because it was easier than confronting the possibility that the evil lay within their trusted circle. Martha Evans, Timmy's mother, who had been so vocal in her condemnation of me, suffered a complete public breakdown. The news of Abernathy's confession, and the horrifying truth of her son's fate at the hands of a man she had known and trusted, shattered her. I saw her once, from a distance, during those first chaotic weeks. She looked like a ghost, her face ravaged by a grief far deeper and more complex than the one she had borne for 20 years. She did try to approach me one day, her eyes filled with a terrible, pleading shame. She managed to stammer out an apology, a broken string of words about being wrong, about her pain making her blind. I listened, my face impassive. I nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. I couldn't offer her comfort, not then. The wounds were too deep, the years of her accusations too heavy. Forgiveness was a landscape I wasn't yet ready to explore. Sheriff Roy Jenkins, who had so readily accepted me as the prime suspect, was forced into early retirement amidst a storm of criticism and an internal investigation into his handling of the original cases. His incompetence, his willingness to follow the path of least resistance and embrace the town's hysteria, had allowed Abernathy to continue his reign of terror for years. He became another pariah in Havenwood, his reputation ruined, a scapegoat for the town's collective guilt, though his culpability was real. The townsfolk who had once scorned me, who had whispered monster as I passed, now avoided my gaze for a different reason: shame. Some made tentative attempts at apology, a mumbled sorry at the grocery store, a awkwardly written note left in my mailbox. Others simply pretended I didn't exist, unable to face the woman whose life they had helped ruin. Ben Carter's podcast, The Havenwood Deception, became a national sensation, laying bare not only Abernathy's crimes but also the story of my wrongful accusation, the societal dynamics that allowed such an injustice to occur and persist. My name was cleared, not with a formal proclamation, but by the sheer, undeniable weight of Abernathy's confession and the horrifying evidence. I was no longer Clara the child snatcher. I was, in the eyes of the media and a shocked public, the woman who had endured an unimaginable injustice, the woman whose quiet persistence, alongside Ben's investigation, had finally brought a serial killer to light. The irony was not lost on me. I had to become a detective to prove I wasn't a criminal. The national media descended on Havenwood, and for a time, my small, dilapidated house was besieged by reporters and television crews, all eager for an interview, for my side of the story. I spoke to a few, carefully, choosing outlets that seemed more interested in the systemic failures than in lurid sensationalism. I told my story, not for fame or pity, but because I hoped it might prevent other towns, other communities, from making the same mistakes, from sacrificing an innocent to appease their fears. The fallout for Abernathy was swift. With his confession and the mountain of evidence, the legal process was a formality. He was an old man, frail and shrunken without his mask of benign respectability, but the evil that radiated from him was still potent. Watching him in court, I felt not hatred, but a profound, weary disgust, and a deep, aching sorrow for his victims and their families, a sorrow that now had a face and a name. The town of Havenwood began a painful, public process of soul-searching. There were town meetings, not to accuse, but to mourn, to question, to try and understand how they had failed so catastrophically. My presence was a constant, silent reminder of that failure. Some looked at me with a new, hesitant respect. Others, I sensed, still harbored a residual discomfort, perhaps because my vindication was a mirror reflecting their own culpability. The truth had been revealed, and its repercussions were reshaping the very fabric of the community. The monster was caged, but the scars he left, on me and on Havenwood, would take a long, long time to fade. This transformation, this sudden shift from pariah to a symbol of resilience, was dizzying. For so long, my world had been defined by their hatred. Now, it was being redefined by their shame and a grudging, newfound respect. The sensation was unfamiliar, and I wasn't yet sure how to navigate it. But one thing was certain: I was no longer invisible. My voice, silenced for 2 decades, was finally being heard. And though the journey had been agonizing, the sound of truth, at long last, was undeniably, deeply, satisfying. The ripples of Abernathy's unmasking spread wide, but the most profound changes were yet to come, not in the town, but within myself. The woman who had hidden from the world for 20 years was slowly, tentatively, beginning to consider what it might mean to step back into it. The immediate aftermath of Abernathy's conviction was a strange landscape of public vindication and private readjustment. The world now knew my name, not as a whispered curse, but as a testament to endurance. Yet, the Clara Holloway who faced this new reality was not the same woman who had lovingly curated the Story Nook 2 decades prior. The ordeal had irrevocably changed me, forging something new from the crucible of suffering and injustice. The timid, somewhat introverted woman was gone, replaced by someone quieter still, perhaps, but with an core of tempered steel I hadn't known I possessed. The most immediate change was a profound sense of lightness, as if an immense, invisible weight I had carried for 20 years had finally been lifted. It wasn't an exuberant joy, but a quiet, pervasive peace. The constant hum of anxiety, the fear of whispers and glares, the internalized shame, it all began to dissipate, like mist burning off in the morning sun. I could walk down Main Street in Havenwood, and while some gazes still held guilt or awkwardness, the outright hostility was gone. In its place was a hesitant curiosity, sometimes even a shy respect. My self-esteem, once shattered into a million pieces, began slowly to mend. I no longer questioned my own sanity or searched my reflection for monstrous traits. I had faced the real monster, looked into the abyss of his deceptions, and I had not only survived, but I had been instrumental in his unmasking. There was a strength in that knowledge, a quiet affirmation of my own worth that no external validation could ever truly bestow, but which the world's acknowledgement now seemed to echo. I started to hold my head a little higher, my gaze a little more direct. The isolation, once a suffocating blanket, started to feel more like a choice. People from Havenwood, and even strangers who had followed the story, reached out. Some were old acquaintances, stammering apologies, expressing a desire to reconnect. I was polite but cautious. The trust that had been so brutally violated would not be easily rebuilt. I found solace in correspondence with some of the other victims' families, a shared understanding of loss and a grim satisfaction in Abernathy's capture that needed no elaborate explanation. Ben Carter remained a steadfast presence. Our unlikely alliance, forged in the pursuit of a terrible truth, had evolved into a genuine friendship. He respected my need for space but was always there with a supportive word or a practical offer of help. His podcast had not only brought Abernathy to justice but had also given me a platform, if I chose to use it, to speak about the dangers of mass hysteria and the importance of due process, of listening to the silenced voices. I began to tentatively reclaim small pieces of my life. The garden, so long neglected, started to receive my attention. The act of nurturing something, of coaxing life from the soil, felt profoundly healing. I painted the faded clapboard of my house, not in the bright, cheerful colors of the Story Nook, but in calm, dignified shades of gray and white. It was no longer the witch's house, but simply my home, a place where I was slowly, carefully, rebuilding a sense of peace and safety. There were scars, of course. A lingering wariness of crowds, a flinch at unexpected loud noises, a tendency towards solitude that had become deeply ingrained. The 20 years Abernathy had stolen from me could never be fully recovered. The dreams I'd had for the Story Nook, the life I might have lived, were ghosts that sometimes whispered in the quiet hours. But I was no longer defined by what I had lost, or by what had been done to me. I was defined by my survival, by my resilience, by the truth that I had helped bring to light. One afternoon, I found myself standing before the boarded-up facade of what was once the Story Nook. It was dilapidated now, a sad relic. For a moment, a pang of the old sorrow went through me. But then, a new thought surfaced. Perhaps its story wasn't over either. Perhaps, in time, something new could grow there. Not for me to run, necessarily, but the idea of it no longer being a monument to my destruction felt important. My transformation wasn't about becoming a hero or a public figure. It was about reclaiming my own narrative, my own dignity. I was stronger, yes, forged in fire. I was more wary of the world, certainly, having seen its darkest underbelly. But I was also, paradoxically, more open to the possibility of quiet goodness, having experienced it in Ben's loyalty and in the hesitant outreach of some who genuinely regretted their past judgments. I was starting over, not from scratch, because the past was part of me, but with the newfound sense of freedom and a quiet authority that came from knowing I had faced the worst and emerged, not unscathed, but whole. The phoenix doesn't rise from the ashes unmarked. It carries the memory of the fire. But it rises nonetheless, its wings stronger for the ordeal. I was beginning to feel the tentative flutter of my own wings, ready to see where they might carry me, no longer a prisoner of Havenwood's lies, but a survivor, a truth-teller, a woman who had finally, painstakingly, reclaimed her name and her spirit. The journey had been impossibly dark, but the dawn, when it finally broke, was all the more precious for the long night that had preceded it. The path to healing is often a quiet one, taken one small step at a time. If my journey from the depths of injustice to this fragile new beginning has touched you, or given you a moment of reflection on the power of truth, I invite you to like this video. And if you're just joining, consider subscribing so you don't miss how this chapter of my life, and Havenwood's, finally finds its resolution. Your support, even in silence, is a reminder that no one's story should be lost. Arthur Abernathy was convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping and murder and sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life in prison, never again to see the outside of a maximum security facility. I attended his sentencing, not for a sense of triumph, but for a sense of closure. Seeing him, stripped of all his former respectability, just an old, broken man facing the consequences of his monstrous choices, was a somber but necessary final act in a tragedy that had consumed so much of my life, and the lives of so many others. There was no joy in it, only the grim satisfaction of justice finally, belatedly, served. In the months and years that followed, Havenwood slowly began to heal, though the scars of Abernathy's betrayal would forever remain etched into its collective memory. The town established a memorial garden for his victims, a quiet, beautiful space near the park where Emily Carter had last been seen. It was a place for reflection, for remembrance, and a stark reminder of the darkness that could hide behind the most familiar of faces. I sometimes visited it, not to dwell on the horror, but to honor the innocent lives that had been lost, and to silently acknowledge the fragility of peace. My own life found a new, quiet rhythm. I didn't seek to become a public crusader, nor did I entirely retreat back into solitude. I found a balance. I started a small online book business, curating collections of children's literature, a nod to my beloved story nook, but on my own terms, from the quiet sanctuary of my home. It was a way to reconnect with my passion for stories, for sharing the magic of words, without having to face the daily scrutiny of a public storefront. The relationship with the townsfolk of Havenwood remained complex. Some, particularly those from the older generation who had been so quick to condemn me, still kept a respectful but noticeable distance, their shame a palpable barrier. Others, especially younger people who had learned of the events through Ben's podcast or later accounts, approached me with a mixture of awe and a desire to understand. I was polite to all, offering neither effusive forgiveness nor lingering resentment. My peace was my own, not dependent on their absolution. Ben Carter became a successful investigative journalist, his career launched by the Havenwood deception. He never forgot what we had been through together, and we maintained a warm, if infrequent, correspondence. He often said I was the strongest person he knew, a compliment I accepted with a quiet smile, knowing the immense cost of that strength. Did I forgive those who wrongly accused me? Forgiveness is a complicated word. I understood their fear, their grief, the human need for answers in the face of the unthinkable. I understood how Abernathy, with his masterful manipulation, had directed that fear towards me. I no longer carried the burning anger or the crushing weight of their hatred. In that sense, perhaps, I had let it go. But forgiveness, if it means forgetting the wound or pretending the scar isn't there, that was something different. My vindication was in the truth being known, not in erasing the past. My house, once a symbol of my isolation and shame, became a place of quiet contentment. The garden thrived under my care, its blooms a vibrant splash of color against the weathered gray of the house. I adopted a stray cat, a scruffy orange tabby who became my steadfast companion, his gentle purring a comforting presence in the quiet rooms. I found joy in small things: the first snowfall of winter, the taste of fresh baked bread, a good book read by the fireside. The whispers in Havenwood didn't entirely stop, of course. But their nature had changed. They no longer spoke of Clara the monster. Now, they spoke of Clara Holloway, the woman who survived, the woman who had faced down unimaginable darkness and emerged with her dignity intact. They spoke of the truth, of resilience, of the terrible secrets their town had held. Havenwood would never forget what happened, nor should it. It was a painful lesson, learned at a terrible cost. As for me, Clara Holloway, I was finally free to write my own story again, not the one dictated by fear and lies, but one of my own choosing. It was a quieter story, perhaps, than the one I had once dreamed of, but it was mine. It was a story of survival, of the enduring power of truth, and of the slow, often painful, journey towards a hard-won peace. The shadows of the past would always linger, a reminder of the darkness I had navigated. But they no longer had the power to consume me. I had found my way back to the light, not by forgetting the darkness, but by understanding it, by confronting it, and by ultimately transcending it. My name was cleared, my spirit, though scarred, was whole. And that, I realized, was a victory more profound than any revenge. My journey was a long and arduous one, filled with pain and injustice. But it also taught me about the resilience of the human spirit and the ultimate power of truth. Thank you for walking this path with me, for listening to my story. If it has touched you in any way, please consider subscribing to hear more tales of survival and justice, and hit that like button. And I'd love to know, as my voice reaches out from my quiet corner of Vermont, what city or town you're listening from. Your presence reminds me that even in our darkest hours, we are not truly alone.